When I take a step, I use my knee, which is a hinge joint, to extend forward. Then I use my foot, which is a hinge joint, to do plantar flexion. Then I bring my arm up using the ball and socket joint in my shoulder, and my head, which I pivot, which end up both being flexion and rotation. When I throw the football, my elbow and wrist extend, and the elbow is a hinge joint, the wrist is a condyloid joint, and then my shoulder performs circumduction, which is a ball and socket joint, and then my hip, which is a ball and socket joint, also rotates.
When I take a step, I use my hip, which is the ball and socket joint, and the movements are flexion and circumduction. I also use my knee, which is the hinge joint, and the movement is extension. I also point my foot, which is plantar flexion, and I use my shoulders, which is the ball and socket joint, and the movement is circumduction. When I do a handstand, I use my wrist, which is the gliding joint, and the movement is dorsiflexion. I also use my shoulders, which is the ball and socket joint, and the movement is circumduction. I also kick my legs up, which uses my hip, and the movements are circumduction. And then I point my toes, which is plantar flexion.
When I take a step, I use the ball and socket joint in my right leg in a circumduction motion, and in an extension motion, the hinge joint in my right knee, as well as the ball and socket joint in my shoulder and the hinge joint in my elbow. When I catch the ball, I use flexion in my right hand with the condyloid joints, and when I bring my arm down, I use circumduction in my right shoulder with the ball and socket joint.
When I'm grabbing a water bottle, the movements I use are circumduction with my ball and socket joint, which is my shoulder, extension with my hinge joint, which is my elbow, extension with my condyloid joints and saddle joint, which is my fingers and thumb, and I'm using the flexion motion when I grab the water bottle with my condyloid joints and saddle joint. To hold the water bottle, I'm using my hinge joint, which is my elbow, in a flexion movement. I'm using my condyloid joint, saddle joint, and gliding joint, which is my fingers, thumb, and wrist, in a flexion movement. And to unscrew the cap of the water bottle, I'm using my condyloid joints, saddle joint, and gliding joint, which is my fingers, thumb, and wrist, in a rotation movement. To take a drink of water, I'm using my ball and socket joint, which is my shoulder, in a circumduction movement, my hinge joint, which is my elbow, in a flexion movement, my condyloid joint, saddle joint, and gliding joint, which is my fingers, thumb, and wrist, in a flexion movement, my pivot joint, which is my neck, in a protraction and retraction movement, which is when I tilt my head back and lean it back forward.